So good morning, everyone. My name's Ivana Jovanovic. I am a Sector Support Officer here at Create New South Wales. Today I'm joining you from Cammergal land, and I'm very privileged to work and live on this land. I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians all across this vast place we call Australia. I pay my respect to the elders past, present and future, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people. So next slide, please. So I'd like to welcome you all to the Museums and History webinar. This is the first in a series of Create New South Wales webinars with our art form boards that will be going through, and sharing the knowledge and expertise from our panel members with you. And it's also an opportunity to see, what the different art form boards are looking for in an application. So I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So we have Peter White joining us from Create New South Wales, who is Senior Manager of Aboriginal Strategies and Engagement. And we have two of our art form boards from the Museums and History Board joining us, Julie Baird, who is Director of Newcastle Museum, and Michael Rolfe, who is CEO of Museums and Galleries New South Wales. So as I said, this webinar will go through engaging and working in partnership with First Nations people, arts and culture in museums and gallery practice. And we'll also go into a few of the insights about what makes a good application. Following this, we will have a Q&A with all speakers. And as I said, if you do have any questions along the way, just feel free to put them in the chat box located in the upper right-hand side of the GoToMeeting window. So without further ado, Peter, over to you. Sorry, Peter, you're just on mute.
I'm muted.
There we go.
Thank you. So as mentioned, I'm the Senior Manager of Aboriginal Strategy and Engagement here at Create New South Wales. I'd also like to pay my respects to the country that I'm on. I live and work on Gadigal land, but I'm a Gamilaroi Murray from northwest New South Wales up around Tamworth and Manila. And I think, I've just been invited in to give a bit of an overview on the importance of encompassing Aboriginal elements and as well as engagement, particularly in this stream of museums and history. One of our big challenges for society and the critical role that museums and history or historians play is that understanding of who you are and where you come from, so you can chart where you're going, and bringing a broader awareness of what for so long has been hidden histories to our society, as well as our new communities that have come, and a bigger understanding. So the importance of actually engaging with an Aboriginal element. My role in the team of strategy and engagement works to how do we build better capacity within the sector, and part of that key role is helping the mainstream sector working more closely with Aboriginal people. So in the context of the webinar today, of course, New South Wales Government and the work that we do is directed by a number of policy fronts. We've just had a new national partnership agreement signed with peak Aboriginal organisations in every single state and territory and federal government on new closing the gap priorities, with the very first time the recognition of art and culture plays in those critical objectives of closing the gap right across health, housing, employment, but also the way Aboriginal people and society are placed within in Australia today. From the New South Wales Government's point of view, we have a long-standing policy called OCA that is assisted and administered through Aboriginal Affairs New South Wales. And OCA, of course, stands for Opportunity for Aboriginal People, Choice, Self-Determination, also healing, so that critical element of truth-telling, as well as addressing past and previous policies and the way it's impacted. the responsibility and empowerment, but how this falls into play with particularly the museum sector, but you can take some strong learnings of the work that's recently been done by AMAGA on a new roadmap for enhancing Indigenous engagement in museums. And it is on their website. We don't have a link there, but I'll put that up later. And that's been developed over a long period, about 1.5 years. And it's built around 5 key elements that taps into different parts of the sector. And the whole emphasis of that is how we build better and stronger relationships with Aboriginal people. And also that, once more, that truth telling, or a lot of people have heard decolonising, the recognition of a way of being and a way of thinking that has existed here in this country for millennia, and the value of actually embracing that, not actually looking at it and trying to reinterpret it for, a lot of cases, a very interested and growing audience base. So if we just go to the next slide. So in terms of the roadmap, there's 5 key elements. I won't go into too much detail, but the first one is reimagining representation, is all about not only truth telling and uncovering or revealing those past histories and experiences, but the second part of that, and the only way you can actually do that, is amplifying the Aboriginal voices of that. So allowing more ways for Aboriginal people to engage with your organisations. And of course, that's a real value, because that brings authenticity, it brings agency within, and it actually is able to bring in some of the new work that's happening, particularly around the resurgence of Aboriginal languages, Aboriginal knowledge. We've seen recently with bushfires and the embracing of Aboriginal cultural knowledge around cultural burns and so forth. So that's a great way of not only helping expand your own organisation, but partnering up with critical elements within the community that, for instance, has been kept aside in many places. Quickly going through, because I know we've got a lot to get through, embedding Indigenous values into museum and galleries business. The roadmap goes through different avenues. The best way to do that is through reconciliation action plans, but also the development of policies and so forth. Increasing Indigenous opportunity. The main thing of that is employing Aboriginal people in critical positions, cultural advisors, but also working with Aboriginal groups and developing partnerships and relationships there. The other thing to consider is procurement. There's lots and lots of Aboriginal businesses in this space now, and how you actually procure, but also looking internally in terms of your own professional development opportunities, and things like cultural awareness and cultural competency, and it ultimately ensuring that these, your museums and that are welcoming spaces for Aboriginal people to engage with. Third one, that increasing Indigenous opportunity. It's mainly a follow-on of that. Once more, representation on boards, policy alignment, partnerships. So they're all critically aligned in the way here. The other critical thing is two-way caretaking of cultural material. Where you have Aboriginal material, whether it's historical, archaeological based, social history, there is a huge level of knowledge embedded within that exists within Aboriginal communities. And once more, partnering and working with Aboriginal people enlivens those objects and brings agency and authenticity to it. But it's also that critical thing, as we acknowledge country at the beginning of meetings and embrace that cultural connection to these materials is still ongoing. And the last one is connecting with Indigenous communities and the best ways to actually do that. Outreach projects, cross-cultural or cross-sector collaborations, as well as, you know, in some instance, repatriation of cultural materials back with your local Aboriginal communities and working with them. So these are all charted within the new roadmap that when you have Aboriginal collections or wanting to do projects or exhibitions and so forth, these are the considerations. It's just not about engaging one artist to come in and work. You know, it's how we change the whole sector. And how to make that happen is, you know, a number of pathways that the roadmap has actually set out. I touched on some of them, but I won't get too bogged down. So I'll hand over to our other speakers about the funding and projects and so forth. But if you have any interest later on about, you know, Aboriginal engagement and so forth, I'm happy to engage with you and give you some pointers. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. So if we could just have the next slide, fantastic. So Julie and Michael, I understand that you'll be chatting a little bit about these points and in relation to one of our successful applicants from the Broken Hill Historical Society. So over to you. Oh, there we go.
Am I? In southern Sydney. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. It's great to be here this morning to be talking about application processes and what success looks like. It's you know, all the comments, of course, are made on the understanding that there are 10, 20, 30, hopefully more applications to the program. There are 9 or so people sitting around the room who assess those applications individually and then come together for that all-important group discussion and ranking. What makes a compelling application? It's the clarity, dare I say, that comes with being well articulated. The storytelling element and the capacity to get the message across. That be content rich, that it is compelling in the sense of the narrative and the outcomes as they're explained, and that there are clear connections throughout to the outcomes that you're proposing, to the partnerships that you're developing and building on, importantly to the budgets, that the budget, the income and the expenditure tells that story. First Nation protocols that Peter has talked about, the way that you involve Aboriginal communities and encourage their leadership. The support material that is provided that is also indicating a solid understanding of the participation that's being developed. And of course, where it's competitive, it's always about the priority areas that Create is looking for, and that those are represented either individually or more than one. I think there are 4 or 5 we'll talk about later, but the priority areas that are woven back into your articulation and your outcomes. A way of ensuring that, and it's not rocket science, getting someone to reread your application so that you can be sure that the interpretation that's in your mind and that the clarity of it is transferred to the application. So there's another view being offered. So you're getting someone else to review. Content rich, and a lot of the questions will come back, I think, to the Broken Hill Historical Society mosque project. But reading through that too, you see that it's incredibly rich in the history and the partnerships of far western New South Wales, the community as it is now formed, and the relationships that people still have to that story, that it is well articulated, And reading through it, you do get that sense of its capacity to tell that story, and that there's a clarity there that is easily understood. It's important because I mentioned those 9 people around the table who are reading application. If you want yours to stand out, it's got to succinctly tell them what the project is, and then it works through each of the questions and each of the rationale to enable it to be well understood. And I can't emphasise that enough. Julie's going to talk about building on the successful partnerships and the ways of demonstrating that. So I'll hand over to Julie now to talk about that component.
And just to back up what Michael said, you know, basically you're writing an exhibition. You're taking big ideas, you're trying to funnel them down into a small label, and you're trying to make people excited about it. Applications that the Art Form Assessment Board read, and in the first introduction they go, wow, this is about this, are more likely to be successful than ones that we read and go, what are you talking about? So I think History and Museum Art Form Board should have the best grant applications, because we're so used to doing that kind of interpretation for people who perhaps don't know the story. One of the things that the Art Form Board is looking for as well is that the money that's given out in grants, there's some sort of long-term sustainability. And I think that demonstrating and building successful partnerships is probably one of the best ways to have a long-term sustainable outcome. Broken Hill is a great example, and that really excited the Art Form Board because there's collaboration across the board. So there's a historical society, there's families, Cameleer families, there's descendants, there's also working with the Aboriginal community, there's also working with Islamic communities as well. There's designers, Melbourne University. So it's a local-led, driven project, but there's also all these ties that go out. So the work that's done not only helps the Historical Society and the visitors, but also this broader range. And that seems to be a bit more of a more bang for your buck for the Art Form Assessment Board going through. It also aids in sort of future work and quality. So that idea of having people read through, so the more people who are involved in your grant application, they're bringing their own particular knowledge, and that brings extra sort of quality to it. And it's also inclusive of different voices. And I think that outcome, the writing your grant that way, is actually better for your visitors. So your visitors are going to get more than one person's idea of what's significant. I think it also aids sort of future success. If you're working with a larger group, if one part of that group falls over, goes away, doesn't want to be involved, that kind of thing, you're more likely to succeed long term. So if it's one person doing one thing without any other voices, then it seems a little bit riskier, perhaps, to the Art Form Board than having a group. It also means that certainly with the call to prayer with Broken Hill, some of their collaborators were creatives that were being hired. So there was historians, there was designers. And so that sort of shows that the money will be used to support arts workers, particularly in a region, and you can't get further out in New South Wales and Broken Hill. So that is a good sign. The other thing that we were looking at was that engaging with local histories. So there's a lot of museums and there's a lot of historians in New South Wales. But I guess what the Art Form Assessment Board is looking for is what makes you distinct. What's your local story? What can you tell better than anyone else? And it doesn't just make a good grant, it also makes a good museum. So the Cameleers and the mosque is a really distinct local story that's different. Couldn't be in Yamba, couldn't be in Bega, couldn't be, in Manly. That is Broken Hill. So using that grant money to interpret a story of a place that's so special and makes it so distinct is I think fantastic. And so, it's not only distinct on a local level, it's distinct on a state and national level. So Create, as a state funding body, is not only doing good work by supporting this for this local community, but it also supports the entire state with the increase of knowledge and some of that spread. I think that the other thing about that local history and communities, particularly in the Call to Prayer one, was that they acknowledged that there was a tourism market to Broken Hill that wasn't getting their story. So they weren't saying, we're going to create this and all these tourists will flock to Broken Hill. They were saying all these tourists flock to Broken Hill, but this story is underrepresented. And I guess, for me, them focusing on that local story, broad community connections, trying to get a lot of people involved, but still telling a local story, I thought was just, a fantastic example of how a historical society can do amazing work that will last for a long time and create connections. That's me.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, Julie. Spot on, as always. And the last point we've been asked to cover is around the priority areas that Create have identified and that we are largely responding to and looking for in applications. It's always advised, of course, that you include and cover at least one. But the good thing about the Broken Hill Historical Society too, I feel, is that they were able to weave a number of the priority areas into the application. But before I talk about that, those priority areas are around, of course, audiences or engagement and worker capacity, people who are involved as producers in these projects. So you're looking for regional New South Wales connections, or Western Sydney connections, New South Wales Aboriginal people, culturally and linguistically diverse people, or COLD as they're often referred to, disability, people with a disability, and young people. So they're the connections or the engagement strategies that you need to be looking at. The Broken Hill Historical Society, as Julie indicated, are working with the Cameleers. So they're covering in broad terms culturally and linguistically diverse. There are the relationships with Aboriginal people, of that story being on country and crossing country, and the untold, as it says in the application, the relationships between Aboriginal people and Cameleers over time, stories that haven't been told. They're looking at young people, and through the involvement of new technologies in the interpretation, are certainly looking at providing opportunities for younger people to participate, perhaps in the maintenance, but also in the ongoing opportunities around the storytelling that comes with the mosque. As was mentioned, this is not about driving tourism to Broken Hill. That's already there. This is about building the capacity of Broken Hill, and Broken Hill itself has identified tourism as its economic lifeline. So the capacity of this particular project to grow and for its story to be told across the priority areas was a crucial factor in the success that it was able to achieve.
Can I just add something? You've got to think of Create grants as a particular tool. So this tool is designed for those priority area engagements. If I'm doing work with what we call young people to do cultural story, then I'll look at Create. If I'm doing something that's just a single story that perhaps doesn't engage with any other priority areas, then I have to look at it through operational funds. So it's almost like this is a particular tool to allow you to stretch out, to get some more of that Aboriginal engagement, to do something with disability or young people or something like that. It's an exciting tool for that particular purpose. So rather than putting in a grant application that perhaps doesn't cover those things and go, well, that's not what we're really about. Well, that's what Create's really about. So you perhaps should think about that and work with Create, because they're so awesome at answering the phone and giving you some of those answers to try and help stretch your application.
Yeah, and the other comment before we go into questions, understand that when these applications come to the board, there are variances in the response from the individuals. So there is discussion, there's argument. It's about individual board members putting their views successfully and unsuccessfully until the consensus or a ranking of the applications is achieved. And to enable your application to win the argument gets back to that articulation and clarity of vision that you're providing in it. So, you know, there's a ranking system. I think it's memory from 1 to 10. There are variances within that really do provide for quite a bit of scope for positive and negative comment. Make it in your application. Make it as clear as possible that that you're a winner.
That's great. I think. So I think what we might just do, because we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, is go on to the Q&A section of the webinar. So I'd like to invite anyone who has a question to please type it in the chat box on the right-hand side. I'll also let everybody know that we will be doing a presentation again, a webinar tomorrow, that will specifically be looking at how to apply, and we'll go into some more of the technical details about the forms, and other kind of practical advice in that respect. So you can join us between 1 to 2 p.m. tomorrow, Tuesday, 15th of September. Myself and my colleague, Colleen Kinchella, will be presenting that webinar. So we did have a few questions posted in Eventbrite prior to this webinar beginning. So I suppose I'll just put it out to all of our speakers, these questions, and then feel free to jump in. So the first question is, how are conflict of interests handled? And I assume that's among the board members.
Yeah, look, conflicts of interest are declared either as real or perceived by the board member prior to assessing the application. And that's noted, and it's then a process where the chair manages that in the meeting. If there's a real conflict, then that member leaves the room for the discussion and the decision. If there's a perceived conflict, then that person has flagged it, and it's part of it's known about all the board that relationship or what it exists. The perceived conflict situation, the board member can stay in the discussion, and then of course there's no conflict.
And you don't even see, like the art form assessment board, if you declare a conflict, you declare it before you even see the applications, and then you never see what the other members of the art form board say about your perceived conflict. So it is quite it's quite strict, and it feels quite secure.
Yeah, thank you, guys. So the next question is a little bit of a long one, so bear with me. This particular person wanted to know if the panel differentiates between museums and organisations that service the museum sector in assessing the need and value for a program. So they've given an example here. So if a number of museums joined together to fund a larger program, which included a third-party non-museum as a managing agent, would this be viewed less favourably than each museum submitting smaller individual projects?
There are 2 points there, I think, and the first one is that projects and programs or museum applications are ranked together, and service organisation, if that's the other grouping, so they're assessed separately in that way and prioritised separately. as to the second part of the question, it's really, I mean, that kind of relationship can be successful, as you described, where there are multiple players. I think we talked about the partnership. So again, it's not such an issue. It's more about the articulation of the project and how it is argued for success. We wouldn't be looking to disqualify something of that nature because it's structured like that. We would be looking at the quality of the application and the outcomes that it proposes.
Beautifully done. Nothing to add.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because a lot of people, you know, ask us for that competitive edge when creating an application, and they need to understand that all applications are ranked based on the clarity, as you said, and the articulation of your proposal. The third question we have here is from the Museum of Chinese Australia, which identifies itself as a startup with limited resources. And does our program support startup organisations?
There's nothing to stop it from supporting a startup. You know, it's again about that clarity. So, you know, probably the Art Form Assessment Board is looking at what they're seeking to achieve. Certainly with startups, if there's steps, so there might be, you know, a step by step how we're going to get there, and this is the first step. So certainly the fact that you're a startup shouldn't make you concerned about the Art Form Assessment Board looking at it less favourably than a longer standing museum or historian.
Yeah, I think with a startup, the key issue there is that there isn't a track record. So to have a clear strategic intent and a step-by-step, as Julie said, that shows how that project is going to develop should it be successful, would be the key to enabling it to be successful.
We just have a question here in the chat box from Catherine, who's asking, does the Art Form Board look at the acquittal documents for the previous year to see how the organisation has performed?
I think if the board requests that during its discussion, create staff who are on hand can provide that information. And I agree, it's really valuable to know how an organisation or an individual has performed if they've been successful previously, and how they've reported through the acquittal process.
And it's about financials and the ability to actually perform what the organisation is proposing. So that's also looked at as well, that health of the organisation.
And I think, you know, just one other thing is that the viability information and reporting is done separately by Create New South Wales, and then that information is provided to the board when they join together for their assessment meetings. So I think that sort of feeds into looking at that previous information. One of the other questions we have here is, can organisational funding be used to subsidise wages for new staff required to support the project?
Do you want us to take that one?
I don't know. I feel like that's more of a Create question. So yes, it is absolutely. You can use our annual funding or project funding to support paying arts workers involved in the project, or staff members that you need to hire to support the museum, especially if it's annual funding. So yeah. The last question, I think we did touch on this in our discussion earlier, but it has to do with, what do you see as the priority areas for funding? So maybe that's in a broader museums and histories context, I suppose.
Yeah, look, I think again, the reason we thought the Broken Hill project would be a good example is because it's building on significant investments over a period of time, and you know, it's building on that real sense of place too, the uniqueness of far western New South Wales and Broken Hill and the histories that are involved there. So, you know, if you're looking for an efficient or an effective spend, if you're looking for an opportunity to add value to an existing program, and also, of course, one that adds to or contributes to the priorities that Create have established and publicised, then it's only going to help with the success of the program. And I think one of the things we want to look for as a board is increased ambition to apply and to make the program to make it really clear that the program is accessible and has opportunities for the museum and history sector to be successful, and you know, to really build that competitiveness, I guess, around the applications that we review.
And we're looking at untold stories or new opportunities. You know, you sit and you read through a lot of applications, but there's some that I get so excited about as a historian and a museum director that this work is happening in New South Wales. So it's that idea of perhaps someone hasn't touched on something before, you write a good application and the board gets excited and wants to be able to support something that hasn't happened before. So innovation and inclusion is looked upon quite favourably.
I suppose I don't think we have any other questions from the chat at the moment, but I was interested in asking you all. So there's a number of obviously very small volunteer-run organisations, particularly out in regional New South Wales, who might want to look at things like digitising or archiving their collections. So what kind of a view does the board have when assessing those types of applications against something, as you said, Julie, that's a bit more exciting and involves, you know, stories that are untold?
Yeah, if I could kick off, I mean, the board has considered a number of applications that have sought to digitise, and collectively we've come to a position where we're a bit cautious about pursuing those at the moment, preferring, because of the technologies involved and the processes and the history of digitisation over the last 30 years or 20 years or whatever it's been, that there's now an opportunity, I think, to have some process of standardisation occur, and to then be reconsidering digitisation in a context where it would be most beneficial. I'm not trumpeting my organisation, but on our website there's a handbook that we published late last year called Crystal Clear that that does provide that framework, and we're using it in a number of projects at the moment that are rolling out or will be rolling out across the state, that provides that framework and sort of overlay of technical specifications that can help in those applications.
And you are talking to your own. So the wonderful thing about Art Form Assessment Board is your application's being read by people who do the same work as you. You know, from regional city across the state. So we do look at collection management, you know, applications that are good, solid museum work that have long-term enhancements just as favourably as some, you know, razzmatazz exciting exhibition or programming or that kind of thing. So, you know, certainly you're not talking to someone who doesn't understand the importance of a really good storage site or a really good collection management program or something that can go out into the community and, you know, share some of that knowledge around. So please don't feel that, you know, I think that's the wonderful thing about Art Form Assessment Boards is we know exactly what good practice is and what's required. So we're not going to turn our noses up at something that is harder to find sponsorship for and is much more likely to find grant sponsorship.
Fantastic, thank you. One of the other questions that I sort of wanted to bring up is we talk a lot about organisations in the museum and history sector, but what about individuals who want to engage with that sector in terms of creating a project that, you know, maybe has to do with archiving or just curating or something like that, that is, you know, with an organisation? So how would you sort of recommend that individuals go about engaging with this particular art form?
Look, it's not a problem for us to consider such an application, or from individuals or people who have an idea. It's really important that they research and that they talk, and that partnership capacity that they might bring to the project before making an application. Work with who you intend to be working with, to articulate, to clarify the project, and to make it as clear, and you know, that the value proposition for the board, but also for the applicant, is clear. Julie.
Successful partnerships, and it's also priority area engagement. So if that's one person or a museum, or 3 museums and another person, as long as you're actually engaging in those areas, and even if you're an individual, if perhaps during this process you're building partnerships. So if you were doing something for another museum or for an area of museums, that's going to be the thing that we look at, not is it one person.
Fantastic. So I think that concludes all of the questions, unless there was anything else that any one of our speakers would like to bring up, just to sort of sum up, you know, our discussion today.
Just to reinforce again that point about the board being really keen to encourage as many applications to the program. We do want to see that success, and we do want to see the competitiveness and the spark coming from the museum and heritage sector for the programs and the applications that we consider. It's an important, it's growing, and don't be put off. I mean, we often hear discussions around the language, and sometimes it's a perceived difficulty to connect to the program. Trust your own interpretation, use plain English, never forget to well articulate and to have your application reviewed. Talk to people before making the application, and be really clear, as the Broken Hill Historical Society were, about the outcomes and the excitement that can be generated from your particular project, and involve Aboriginal people.
In museums and history, often in a regional context, you sometimes get overlooked. You don't have as many nice openings as the art gallery. This board is for you. You know, this is a way that Create New South Wales is spreading that knowledge. And yeah, I'm a bit biased, but I reckon we're the best board.
So just another question here from Catherine, I think that's probably for me, which is, what is the session tomorrow about? So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So we'll be discussing how to apply, which is a more practical, we'll go through the key criteria, the merit, impact and viability, how to best, you know, provide your contact, support material, and all of the practical things in making an application. And yeah, so these are our open rounds at the moment. We have Creative Koori projects, we have project funding, and we have annual organisation funding. One of the changes that we've made this year is that now organisations are assessed against other organisations, and individuals are assessed against other individuals, and that is despite the art forms that they applied for. So that's across the board. Those grant and funding rounds close at 5 p.m. on the 23rd of September. We have our small project grants program, which is open to individuals only, and that is a rolling program assessed roughly every 3 weeks, which has no closing date. And we've recently opened the Country Arts Support Program, which is really targeting regional New South Wales, and also involves the regional arts development officers to provide small grants from $3,000 to $5,000 to organisations. And that closes on the 29th of September. So I think that concludes everything. I would like to thank Julie, Michael and Peter for joining us today. It's much appreciated. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure that the sector has appreciated you sharing your knowledge today with us. So any questions or further inquiries that hasn't been answered today, just please feel free to contact us at Create New South Wales. We're here to have a chat about, whatever you need to talk to us about regarding your application or your project ideas. That's what we're here for. So yes, thank you all very much. And yeah,